Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. And again, I'm Corby Martin from the Pennington Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And next I'll be talking about the application of these different weight loss calculators and models to weight loss counseling. And here we have my disclosure slide, which is available to you. And let's talk about the big picture of what we'll review today. So what I'm going to argue is that the application of energy balance models to modify behaviors, such as diet and physical activity, with the ultimate goal of improving health, such as reducing body weight or decreasing blood pressure, is very much dependent on the application of behavior change theory and theoretically based interventions. And what I'll argue is that we can utilize any number of different models and also any number of different technologies to reach this end, but we really have to deploy the models and the technology in a theoretically based intervention. And by the way, this wasn't necessarily clear earlier, but the models that I'll be referring to are indeed these weight loss calculators that Kevin, Diana, and others have developed that predict weight change over time if a person is adherent to a diet. All right, so we've published a pretty good summary of these behavior change principles. Also, there's a number of very good review articles by Rena Wing, Tom Wadden, Gary Foster, and others that really summarize quite nicely how these behavioral principles are applied to weight loss treatments. So just a brief review of these models or these theoretical principles from, like, say, 30,000 feet. We have learning theory. Now, learning theory postulates that we need temporally contiguous feedback that is based on objective data to promote superior behavior change and to really engage people in treatment. So this is really a fundamental principle that we have in behavior change therapy, in behavior change theory that many of us may have forgotten over the years because we've very much now gotten into different technologies and different gadgets to track behavior. We also have self-determination theory and the theory of planned behavior, which basically postulate that behavior change requires a conducive environment where behavioral goals are clearly defined and self-efficacy is promoted. So we do this pretty well in many weight loss treatments, and you now know that there are a number of different apps for a number of different things that do this very well. So here on the screen we have a little mapping app from a smartphone. And the key thing about this app is that it shows you clearly what your ultimate goal is, which is to say, get over here, and it shows you where you're at in the moment, and it also tells you what to do and when. So here the app will tell you to take a right shortly before this intersection, which is much more helpful than getting the information that you should have taken a right after you've gone through the intersection. So these apps have really done a pretty good things in terms of getting us to a certain goal or a certain location, and it's our job to really create weight loss interventions that function with that degree of nimbleness and based on the objective data that you would find in that app. Now, the thing I'm going to mention next is that in the clinic, so our clinic-based weight loss interventions are very much considered the gold standard. So we know that we can produce very good weight loss over 6 or 12 months when we have an intensive clinic-based weight loss intervention. We've done that for a number of decades and we can really do it quite well. But even within those gold standard interventions, we can really find ourselves in a bind because we have to rely a lot on the patient's self-report about their diet and physical activity. And so most of us, when we see patients in a clinic-based intervention, we may see that patient once a week or so. Therefore, the patient is self-reporting what they've done over the previous week, and that can really put us in a tough spot to be maximally effective at helping them modify their behavior and be most successful at managing their body weight. So we know that self-reported behaviors are frequently inaccurate, especially if it's retrospective, where a person has to recall what they did last Sunday or Tuesday or Saturday. There is also social desirability with self-reported behavior, so we tend to report what we did with kind of a rosy glow. That doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And also, traditionally, in our clinic-based weight loss interventions, we really had limited access to objective near real-time data. So I know that now we have a lot of activity trackers that can track activity in real time. We also now have bathroom scales or body weight scales that transmit data to the internet and make it available to us in near real time. But historically, it was really difficult for us to understand when we see a patient on a week-to-week basis What exactly happened with their behavior over the previous week, when it happened, and why it happened? Because to modify the behavior, we need to know the context of that behavior, such as the antecedents and consequences of the behavior. And once we start to better understand those things, we can toggle them to help the patient manage their behavior and be more successful. So as I mentioned, technology has really helped us develop and deliver interventions that theoretically can more closely adhere to behavior change principles. But I really have to stress that the application of these technologies or the use of these devices does little on its own to actually change behavior. So because a patient purchases a Fitbit or is given a Fitbit, that doesn't mean they're going to magically start running marathons. They might increase their activity for a week or two, but after a while they will very much go back to baseline unless, of course, they utilize that activity tracker in the context of a theoretically based intervention to indeed increase activity. And then again, if we increase activity, that may not necessarily mean that the patient will lose a lot of weight, which may be what they're coming to you for. So you have to make sure that the behavior change principles and your goals are really lining up with the desired outcomes of the patient. Again, we have bathroom scales now that can transmit data to the internet. All of us are aware of the different activity trackers, whether they be in your phone, in your watch, or perhaps on a device that you also wear. And these are great because they are transmitting objective, or at least more objective data in real time that you have access to. But using that data needs to be done diligently in a theoretically based intervention. All right, so next I really want to highlight two recent developments, say at least they're recent over the past 5 or 6 years. And this is a new way to think about our interventions, especially our interventions that we plan to deliver remotely. So mobile health applications are quite popular now, and these interventions are very adaptable and can be considered ecological momentary interventions or just-in-time adaptive interventions. And EMIs deliver treatment to patients in their natural environment, usually via communication devices such as smartphones. And this methodology is acceptable to patients, and it does pretty good at objectively tracking progress toward goals. So these interventions work because, again, they're relying on the objective data. Now, the more recent literature refers to just-in-time adaptive interventions. And this is a very good definition that I think really summarizes the theme of what we're trying to do with mobile health. Just-in-time adaptive interventions aim to meet the needs of patients by providing only the type and amount of intervention resources required by an individual and only when it is needed. That really summarizes quite nicely different mobile health interventions that really want to be nimble and deliver resources only to those people that need it when they need those resources. And then, of course, the patients that are doing well can receive some positive reinforcement, but you don't want to dedicate as many resources to them if it's not absolutely necessary. Okay, next we're going to quickly review the application of what is ultimately a pretty unsophisticated model that predicts weight change over time based on, in this project, a 25% calorie restriction. And so I say that this model isn't nearly as advanced as what, say, Kevin and Diana have developed, because we developed this way back when, really with regression equations. So we won't go into the details here, but as you can see, we developed a model that predicts weight change over time, assuming adherence to 25% energy restriction. There's error in the model, so we built out these bounds based on the error term. And we then plotted individual patients' body weight in relation to this zone over time, and we used that as a guide to determine whether or not the patient was on track and whether or not they needed additional resources. And this is exactly how our counselors in this trial were able to really leverage these objective data and to really try to mimic or try to articulate and follow what you might call a just-in-time adaptive intervention. So during this project, again, we tracked body weight over time. This was a clinic-based study, so every time the patients came into the clinic, we would plot their body weight on the graph and we would print it out and then go over the graph with them. And the counselors in this trial were always keeping notes on these graphs, and it was a great way to kind of illustrate and work with the patient in a collaborative environment to identify what works for that patient and what doesn't work. And so here what you can see is that the first 4 weeks of the study, we actually provided all of the food to these patients, and you can see that food provision works. It produces very good adherence to your diet. When people start eating ad lib, even though they should be following the diet, they of course struggle a bit and their weight loss tends to flatten out. And for this individual patient, the coach really worked with the patient to identify the fact that when the patient was MIA and wasn't coming in for their clinic visits, their weight was of course going up. So this coach really worked with the patient to develop contracts such that whenever the patient felt like they were struggling or they didn't feel like coming in, the patient knew that those were the days where they absolutely should call their counselor right away and make an appointment. And then what you can see is we kept track of the fact that this patient really responded quite positively to portion-controlled foods, no big surprise. And we would also mix up the way in which the patient was self-reporting their food intake. They would use, say, a Palm Pilot for a while, then they use pen and paper, then they would use a smartphone app and so forth. And just kind of changing up the way in which they track diets tended to help. Now, here we have the outcome data from Calorie Phase 2. In this trial, we followed people for 2 full years, and again, the goal was 25% energy restriction. And what you can see from this graph is that using this weight graph approach in a clinic-based intervention really worked quite nicely. So we produced about 10% weight loss over 2 years. That's very good, especially considering that these people were really quite lean. The BMI range at baseline was 22 to 28 with a mean of about 25.1 based on my memory. And this is all very good, but again, it's really a tightly controlled weight loss study conducted at the Pennington Center. So are we able to really translate these different approaches and disseminate them on a much broader basis so they're more available to your average Joe out in the community? And that is exactly what Peter Kaczmarczyk and colleagues are testing now in a trial that we got funded through the PCORI. And this trial is called the Louisiana Trial to Reduce Obesity in Primary Care. And what we've done here is we've really tried to adapt this weight graph approach into an intervention that can be disseminated widely throughout the state of Louisiana via PCP clinics. So these are primary care clinics where patients are coming in to see their physician, and there's actually a coach that resides in that community that has been part of that community for decades who we hired to really deliver the intervention, and we're testing whether or not this more effectiveness type approach can work in a large-scale, more real-world setting. We'll end up with over 400 or 450 patients in the intervention arm, roughly equal in a control arm. We are also using a hybrid approach where some of the sessions end up being remote just due to necessity because, of course, the patients can't always come into the clinic, so we will do some remote counseling as well. So that brings us to Smart Loss, which is an app that we developed that basically mimics the intervention from Calorie. However, we're delivering this intervention remotely. So many of you have seen these slides before. All of the patients in this initial trial received treatment remotely. They didn't come into the center at all to receive treatment, and we sent them home with a bathroom scale, and they were asked to weigh every day. When they stood on the scale, of course, the data gets beamed to the internet. We can then grab that data and plot it on their individual weight graph, and we can push it back to their smartphone or send it to them via email. And indeed, these weight graphs are available to a clinician who, consistent with the just-in-time adaptive intervention, can survey that data, send reinforcements to people who are doing well, and then dedicate the most resources to the people who are struggling. We also track activity doing the same thing, so we can plot their steps per day versus their step graph. You get the idea. This is pretty straightforward. And this type of approach works really quite well. So here we're reporting the data from a pilot study that we did many years ago, and we'll call this Smart Loss version 1 because we didn't yet have all of the software infrastructure built to do all of this automatically. And so this is what I want to highlight, where it's not necessarily the technology that makes these interventions work, but it's really delivering an intervention that is grounded in behavior change theory. Because during this first study, we had very good technology to get the data to the internet, but we would then manually quickly grab it and plot it manually and then push it to them via email. So it was very much rudimentary, but it tended to work. Over 3 months, we produced weight loss of about 9.5% versus a health education attention match control that lost about 0.5%. Also, as many of you know, there are models available for other populations. Here, I refer to an article by Diana Thomas and colleagues that articulates a gestational weight gain model where you can identify the energy intake values that will help promote adherence to the IOM gestational weight gain guidelines. And here also, there was an abstract published from Obesity Week 2015 where Leanne Redmond and colleagues report the results of an RCT to promote appropriate levels of gestational weight gain. I'm going to wrap this up by highlighting one other application of these models for clinical intervention delivery, and that is using these models to help dispel myths that many patients and many of us espouse about weight loss. So we always know that metabolic adaptation is a real thing. So as we lose weight, we do have a decrease in metabolism that is greater than what you'd expect based on your change in energy stores. Fair enough. Our research shows that if you lose about 10%, it's about 100 calories per day or thereabouts. And this model that Diana and colleagues developed really helped illustrate the fact that metabolic adaptation doesn't really account for the 6-month weight loss plateau, and many other models have shown this as well. But what you can see is that even if you have a pretty high level of metabolic adaptation, you still lose weight over a year or two, but if you have higher metabolic adaptation, you of course lose less than if you have no or a more moderate level of metabolic adaptation. But again, you're not seeing a 6-month weight loss plateau here at 6 months with any degree of metabolic adaptation. We've also then used these calculations to really help educate patients on exactly how very small levels of dietary non-adherence after 6 or 8 months can really cause a weight loss plateau. So remember that early in treatment, when you have, say, a 700 or an 800 calorie per day deficit, you can cheat a little bit throughout the day and you can still lose weight because you have this very large energy deficit. But if you're successful and you lose weight, that energy deficit, of course, shrinks to 150 or 100 calories per day until, of course, you reach a new equilibrium. And so what we can demonstrate is that after 6 or 7 months, people can cheat about 15%. I think the non-adherence was 15% on 2 or 3 days based on these models, if I remember correctly, Diana. And basically you can show that just cheating a little bit on the weekends can actually cause a weight loss plateau. And once the patients understand that, then you can work with them to really target the weekends or any other situations where they have this little intermittent non-adherence, shore that up, and then of course have them continue to lose weight for a few more months. All right, I would very much like to acknowledge my collaborators. They are listed here, and I also reference the funding sources that were relevant to the research that we reviewed today. And I'd like to thank you, and hopefully we have time for some questions. And I will also make a plug. EB is a fantastic conference, as is Obesity Week. We'll be in DC this year at the end of October and early November. I'm on the board of managers, so I'm obligated to give you this pitch. Great.
Hi, Mike Kelly. Corby, I was struck in some of your slides by the treatment offered to people, essentially the individual feedback, the individual encouragement, the instruction, and so forth. It's all through your slides. I wanted to ask you to reflect on that and then contrast with, we have recommendations for dietary intakes, we have recommendations for physical activity, and even non-government recommendations for habits. How much should we expect from simply delivering recommendations to people absent the type of attention that you've mentioned here?
Yeah, so I think what we've learned is that doing weight loss research or weight loss clinical services is horrifically humbling. And what we learned early on is that, as most of us in the room understand, that health education simply isn't enough. So if a patient knows that they should be exercising 150 minutes per week at a moderate intensity, that's great for them to know, but for them to actually achieve that goal, they have to have a pretty regimented plan on how to get there and how to achieve that goal. And then if they ever do achieve it, how to maintain it, because that's also a big part of the problem. So what we've done here is we've tried to, of course, we're providing all of that health education, whether it be nutrition education or education on physical activity, but we're trying to more objectively outline a way that they can make health improvements and also know if they're moving the needle in the right direction. So I don't really play this up here, but we, of course, have them tracking their steps per day as well, and we're trying to get them above 150 minutes per week, and then we have a little crosswalk database to translate their steps into minutes. So that's, of course, really important. But again, I want to highlight that we don't believe that kind of education alone is really going to move the needle in the direction that we want. The other thing I'll mention is that we really do try to make this highly individualized. And I think the benefit of using these approaches is it ends up being a very collaborative relationship with a patient where you're working with a patient to problem solve and to help identify solutions. And so to me, it feels a bit more collaborative. And I say that because we did have a few false starts when we first started this approach, where we would have patients also track their energy intake with the food record. And we wouldn't really purely convey that that's really just a clinical tool, a behavioral tool to help kind of see their patterns of food intake. But they would think that the energy intake values from the food record were real. And we would then essentially be calling them liars when we'd say they weren't adherent to the diet based on their body weight. So there is kind of an art or a skill set you have to learn, but it really does end up being a very collaborative process, and it is highly individualized. Hopefully that answers your questions.
Barbara Lyle. My question is about your just-in-time models, and how much have you explored time of day or moment that's most effective to intervene? And the reason I ask is I've spent many years working with marketing people trying to figure out how to develop better-for-you foods, and almost always there was more success in the morning, and as you got to the later in the day and evening when people have expended all their emotional energy, it was harder for them to make any kind of a trade-off. So time of day, are you finding that's effective to consider?
It's very effective. I mean, what we find is that the weekends are trouble for people, obviously, and also evenings are trouble. So we'll actually dedicate most of our intervention resources to targeting food intake past 4:30 p.m. And incidentally, as you know, many individuals who are overweight or obese also have this kind of night eating type pattern where they consume greater than 50% of their calories past 4:30 or 5 p.m. And so we'll very much target that. And I think one benefit of these just-in-time adaptive interventions is you are getting objective real-time data. For example, we will actually have patients take pictures of their meals at night or in the evening and send those to us in real time. And it really drives accountability because they know we're going to see that, and we'll send them immediate feedback about ways in which they can eat healthier. So we'll get pictures where the person is eating a crazy dinner, right? It's like a big, huge plate of fried fish or whatever, and we can immediately give them better recommendations. But what we find is that because they know that there's going to be that intermittent accountability, it kind of drives them to be healthier during that time because they know that we could ask or hope to see that objective data really anytime.
Morning, Steve Oste from UC Davis. As an economist, I worry about the costs associated with these highly individualized and very kind of labor-intensive coaching activities. Are you keeping track of this so we can see where the efficiency gains are and where we need to kind of stop pushing on an individual basis?
Boy, great question. Yeah, so we actually partner with Mick Tilford in Arkansas, and he helps us do our cost effectiveness analyses. So we are indeed actually quantifying the cost effectiveness of these approaches versus, say, your gold standard clinic-based intervention, which is actually really, really expensive. Here you have less overhead and less time on the part of the counselor. We have a grant currently under review that really tries to automate much more of the process and create smarter virtual counselors. So we'll see whether or not we can disseminate these more broadly and cost effectively, but still get an effect size that is meaningful enough to move the needle on public health. So we are tackling that, but that is a different skill set where we have to, of course, get collaborators to partner with. Yeah. Great, thank you.